our teacher, and he comes to live inside of us. When Jesus ascended on high, he said, I'm going to send you a helper.
Millions have looked to Joyce Meyer for guidance, inspiration, and strength through life's darkest moments. But behind the uplifting sermons and worldwide success lies a story filled with painful secrets, growing controversy, and shocking accusations that many supporters never saw coming. From heartbreaking trauma to criticism surrounding her ministry and personal life, the troubling details continue to raise difficult questions. As more layers of her past resurface, some are beginning to wonder if the tragedy surrounding Joyce Meyer is far worse than anyone imagined. The dark childhood Joyce Meyer tried to hide. Long before Joyce Meyer became one of the most recognizable voices in Christian television, she was living through a childhood filled with fear, silence, and emotional devastation. To millions watching her preach about healing and hope, she appeared confident and strong. But behind that public image was a young girl carrying painful memories that would haunt her for decades. And according to Joyce herself, the suffering began inside her own home. Born Pauline Joyce Hutchison in 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri, her early life was far from peaceful. While many families in post-war America were rebuilding their lives, Joyce's household became a place dominated by tension and control. Her father, a World War II veteran, reportedly returned home deeply troubled, and over time, the environment inside the house became increasingly toxic. What outsiders saw as a normal family was, behind closed doors, something much darker. Joyce later revealed that she endured repeated abuse throughout her childhood, allegedly at the hands of her father. The trauma was not a one-time event, but something she claimed happened again and again over the course of many years. The emotional damage left behind would shape the way she viewed herself, relationships, and even faith. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was the silence surrounding it. According to Joyce, her mother suspected something was wrong, but felt powerless and afraid to step in. That silence left Joyce feeling abandoned during the moments she needed protection the most. At school and around other people, she learned how to hide what was happening. She smiled, blended in, and tried to appear normal while privately carrying fear and shame that no child should ever experience. Like many survivors of abuse, she kept her suffering buried deep inside, terrified that nobody would believe her, or that speaking out would make things worse. The emotional isolation slowly became part of her everyday life. Even the smallest details inside the home were reportedly controlled. Rules, routines, and constant tension created an atmosphere where Joyce never truly felt safe. Over time, those experiences affected her confidence and emotional stability. Although she became a Christian at a young age, faith alone did not immediately erase the pain she was dealing with. She believed in God, but she was also struggling with confusion, anger, and emotional wounds that continued to grow beneath the surface. Years later, Joyce would openly speak about these experiences during sermons and interviews, using her story as part of her message about survival and healing. But for many people, hearing the details was shocking. It completely changed the way they viewed her rise to fame. Behind the success, the books, and the packed arenas was someone who had spent years battling memories she could never fully escape. And while escaping that painful childhood may have seemed like the beginning of a better life, what happened next only pushed Joyce into another chapter filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and emotional chaos. The shocking marriage that nearly destroyed Joyce Meyer. After surviving a deeply troubled childhood, Joyce Meyer believed adulthood would finally bring the peace and stability she had been longing for. But instead of escaping emotional pain, she found herself stepping into another destructive situation that would leave even deeper scars behind. What began as an attempt to build a new life quickly turned into a relationship filled with betrayal, instability, and heartbreak. As a young woman, Joyce entered her first marriage hoping to leave her painful past behind. Like many people carrying unresolved trauma, she was searching for comfort, security, and someone who would make her feel valued. But according to her own accounts, the man she married brought chaos into her life almost immediately. He reportedly worked as a part-time car salesman, but behind the surface, Joyce described him as dishonest, manipulative, and reckless. The marriage soon became emotionally exhausting. Joyce later shared that her husband would disappear for days at a time without explanation, leaving her worried and financially stranded. Instead of building trust, the relationship created constant uncertainty. The emotional pressure only intensified when she became pregnant with their son, David. During what should have been one of the happiest moments of her life, she claimed her husband abandoned her and became involved with another woman. For Joyce, it was another devastating reminder that the people closest to her often became the source of her greatest pain. The marriage reportedly lasted 5 difficult years, years she would later describe as filled with emotional suffering and disappointment. But one of the most shocking revelations from that period involved the illegal actions she became caught up in while trying to survive the relationship. According to Joyce, her husband convinced her to steal payroll checks from the company where she worked. He would allegedly cash the checks himself, using the money to support their lifestyle. Looking back, Joyce admitted it was a terrible decision driven by fear, manipulation, and desperation, rather than greed. Years later, she publicly said she repaid the money in full after turning her life around, hoping to correct the mistakes tied to that dark chapter. The emotional damage from the marriage went far beyond financial problems. By the time the relationship finally collapsed, Joyce was left emotionally drained and struggling to trust anyone. Her husband eventually faced legal trouble and was reportedly sentenced to prison, bringing the marriage to an end. But even after the divorce, the emotional wounds did not simply disappear. During that period, Joyce found herself spiraling emotionally. She later admitted she turned to unhealthy habits and reckless behavior while trying to numb years of pain and rejection. Beneath the surface, she was still battling the trauma of her childhood while carrying the weight of another broken relationship. For a while, it seemed like her life was heading further into darkness instead of healing. But just when everything appeared completely shattered, Joyce encountered someone who would slowly begin changing the direction of her future. And that unexpected turning point would eventually lead her toward the ministry that made her famous around the world. The moment Joyce Meyer's entire future changed. After years of emotional pain, broken relationships, and personal struggles, Joyce Meyer's life finally began moving in a different direction. But few could have predicted that the same woman who once felt trapped by fear and rejection would eventually become one of the most recognizable religious figures in the world. Her rise to fame did not happen overnight, and behind the success was a story filled with inner battles, emotional healing, and a growing desire to completely rebuild her life. One of the biggest turning points came after Joyce met Dave Meyer, an Army veteran and engineering draftsman whose calm personality stood in sharp contrast to the chaos she had experienced for most of her life. The two met in 1966, and according to Joyce, Dave's patience and steady support gave her something she had rarely experienced before: stability. While their relationship was far from perfect, it became the foundation that helped Joyce slowly begin confronting the emotional wounds she had carried since childhood. Joyce has openly admitted that the trauma from her past deeply affected her behavior during their marriage. She struggled with anger, control issues, and emotional outbursts, often taking her frustrations out on the people closest to her. But unlike the toxic relationships she had experienced before, Dave reportedly refused to respond with chaos. Over time, his consistent support helped create a sense of safety that Joyce had never fully known. At the same time, her spiritual life was becoming more intense. Although she had believed in God from a young age, Joyce later explained that she still felt emotionally empty for years. Then, in February 1976, she experienced what she described as a life-changing spiritual moment. Feeling overwhelmed and desperate, Joyce cried out to God while struggling internally with frustration and emotional exhaustion. According to her testimony, that moment became the beginning of a major personal transformation. Soon after, she started speaking about faith in small Bible study groups and workplace gatherings. Unlike traditional preachers, Joyce spoke openly about emotional struggles, insecurity, fear, and trauma. That raw honesty connected with people almost immediately. Many listeners felt they were hearing someone who actually understood pain instead of simply preaching about it from a distance. What started as small meetings quickly grew larger. By 1980, Joyce became an associate pastor at Life Christian Center in Missouri, and her teaching ministry continued expanding throughout the decade. She eventually launched radio programs and began recording teachings from a tiny studio setup inside her home. Those humble beginnings would later evolve into something far bigger than almost anyone expected. By the 1990s, Joyce Meyer's television broadcasts were reaching viewers across the country. Her program, Enjoying Everyday Life, became one of the most recognized Christian shows internationally, airing in over 100 countries. Beyond television, her ministry also launched outreach programs focused on feeding families, disaster relief, and helping struggling communities. To supporters, Joyce represented hope, survival, and emotional healing after hardship. But as her popularity and influence exploded, so did the criticism. Questions about her teachings, beliefs, and growing wealth slowly began following her ministry everywhere. And before long, Joyce Meyer would find herself at the center of controversies that sparked outrage far beyond the church world. Why Joyce Meyer's ministry sparked major backlash. As Joyce Meyer's influence continued growing across television, bookstores, and packed conference arenas, not everyone was convinced her message reflected traditional Christian teaching. While millions admired her honesty and motivational style, others began raising serious concerns about some of the beliefs and ideas coming from her ministry. Over time, those criticisms would grow impossible to ignore. One of the biggest controversies surrounding Joyce Meyer involved her connection to the prosperity gospel movement. This belief system teaches that strong faith, positive confession, and obedience to God can lead to financial blessings and personal success. Supporters viewed her message as empowering and encouraging during difficult times, but critics argued it painted an unrealistic picture of faith, one that seemed to link spiritual devotion with material rewards. Some church leaders became especially troubled by statements suggesting that personal struggles, sickness, or hardship could sometimes be connected to weak faith or negative thinking. For people already suffering through tragedy or illness, those teachings felt harsh and deeply upsetting. Many believed the message placed blame on vulnerable individuals instead of offering compassion. Although Joyce later acknowledged that some of her earlier teachings lacked balance, the backlash had already left a lasting mark on her reputation. The criticism did not stop there. Certain comments Joyce made about Jesus and spiritual warfare also sparked intense theological debate. In past sermons, she discussed ideas connected to the Word of Faith movement, including controversial teachings about what happened to Jesus after the crucifixion. Those statements drew sharp reactions from many Christian scholars and pastors who argued that her interpretations conflicted with core biblical doctrine. At the same time, many of her followers defended her fiercely. They appreciated her willingness to discuss emotional battles, fear, anxiety, and spiritual struggles in a direct and relatable way. Unlike more traditional speakers, Joyce often blended personal experience with practical advice, making her sermons feel accessible to ordinary people dealing with everyday problems. That authenticity helped her build a loyal audience, even as criticism continued growing louder. Still, the divide inside the Christian community became impossible to ignore. Some viewed Joyce Meyer as a survivor using her painful past to help others heal. Others believed parts of her ministry had drifted too far from biblical teaching and toward motivational self-help mixed with prosperity-focused ideas. The debate followed her for years, creating tension between supporters and critics every time another controversial sermon resurfaced online. In 2019, Joyce publicly admitted that certain teachings from earlier in her career were mistakes. She acknowledged that implying people lacked faith because of illness or tragedy was wrong and needed correction. For some supporters, the statement showed humility and growth. But for critics, it raised another question. Why did those teachings remain influential for so long before being addressed? And while the debates surrounding her beliefs continued making headlines, an even bigger controversy was quietly building behind the scenes, one involving luxury, massive spending, and growing questions about where ministry money was really going. The lavish lifestyle that sparked outrage around Joyce Meyer. As Joyce Meyer's ministry expanded into a worldwide brand, attention slowly shifted away from only her sermons and teachings. Critics and watchdog groups began looking much closer at the enormous wealth connected to her organization, and what they discovered sparked major controversy. For many people, the growing concerns were not just about money. They were about whether a ministry built on faith and generosity had become consumed by luxury and excess. Reports eventually revealed that Joyce Meyer and several members of her family were living in multi-million-dollar homes located in an exclusive gated community near St. Louis. Her personal residence alone reportedly carried a price tag of more than $2 million, while additional properties connected to family members added millions more. Supporters argued that successful ministry leaders were allowed to live comfortably, but critics questioned whether such wealth aligned with the message being preached to struggling viewers donating their money in hopes of spiritual guidance. The controversy intensified once details about the ministry's headquarters and spending habits became public. Financial reports showed expensive decorations, luxury furnishings, and high-end artwork inside the organization's massive headquarters facility. Among the purchases that drew the most backlash were a $30,000 decorative table and an antique commode reportedly costing more than $20,000. To critics, those items became symbols of extravagance that seemed completely disconnected from the ministry's public image of helping ordinary people through hardship. Then came one of the most talked-about purchases of all, a private Gulfstream jet reportedly worth around $10 million. Joyce defended the aircraft by explaining that extensive travel was necessary for ministry work and international outreach. But the optics were difficult to ignore. To many observers, the jet represented something much larger: the growing perception that certain televangelists were living lifestyles closer to celebrities than religious leaders. Government attention soon followed. In 2007, the United States Senate Finance Committee launched an investigation into several high-profile televangelists, including Joyce Meyer Ministries. The inquiry focused on whether religious organizations were abusing their tax-exempt status and using ministry funds irresponsibly. Reports surrounding the investigation mentioned large salaries, luxury spending, and questions about financial oversight inside these organizations. In response to public criticism, Joyce later announced she had reduced her salary and would rely more heavily on book royalties for personal income. Still, many skeptics remained unconvinced, especially as her books and broadcasts continued generating massive revenue worldwide. Questions about transparency and accountability continued following the ministry for years. But while financial controversy created headlines and public backlash, an even darker series of events was still ahead. Tragedies and scandals that would shake the ministry in ways few people could have imagined. The untold scandals connected to Joyce Meyer Ministries. As Joyce Meyer's ministry continued operating on a global scale, the pressure and scrutiny surrounding the organization only intensified. But beyond the teachings, finances, and public image, darker events began surfacing, incidents that would shake trust and raise unsettling questions about what was happening behind the scenes. One of the most disturbing moments came in 2009, when Christopher Coleman, who served as the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, became linked to a horrifying crime. Coleman was later accused of murdering his wife and 2 young sons in a case that shocked the community. What made the situation even more unsettling was the revelation that he had been living a double life, including an extramarital affair and deceptive behavior that went unnoticed by those around him. Investigators later uncovered claims that Coleman had allegedly staged fake threats against his own family in an attempt to create a misleading narrative. The case revealed manipulation, planning, and deception on a level that raised serious concerns about how warning signs may have been missed. As the story unfolded, questions began to circulate about whether stronger oversight within the ministry could have prevented such a tragedy from escalating unnoticed. The victim's family eventually filed a wrongful death lawsuit, arguing that the ministry failed in its responsibility to recognize danger signals tied to Coleman's behavior. They claimed leadership was aware of troubling issues, but did not take appropriate action. However, the case was later dismissed, with the court finding insufficient grounds to hold the organization legally accountable. Even so, the damage to public perception had already been done. Years later, another controversy surfaced when Joyce Meyer Ministries ended its partnership with Daystar Television Network in 2025. The decision came after serious allegations were raised involving leadership behavior and ethical concerns connected to the broadcaster. The split reflected growing tension within religious media networks about accountability, transparency, and trust. For many observers, these events painted a complicated picture, one where influence, faith, and leadership were constantly tested by crisis after crisis. While supporters continued to defend the ministry's mission, critics pointed to repeated controversies as signs of deeper structural issues that could not be easily ignored. And as the spotlight continued to shift between faith and failure, one final question remained hanging in the air. How much of this story was about one woman's ministry? And how much was about the hidden cost of power itself? Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, subscribe for more deep dives into untold truths behind famous figures. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below.